Welcome to this rapid revision session on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the most important laws in the history of civil rights. Firstly, though, we need to consider the 1957 Civil Rights Act, an act that was far less comprehensive and, frankly, less successful in bringing change. This was passed during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was president between 1953 and 1961. Brown versus the Board of Education and the Montgomery bus boycott had caused a violent white backlash, which in turn led to increased sympathy for the civil rights cause by 1957. In the South, black people often had little or no right to vote. The 1957 Civil Rights Act was passed to allow federal courts to prosecute states who refused black people a vote. But this wasn't as simple as you'd think. Any such cases would have to be heard by an all-white state jury, and it's unlikely that they would prosecute their own states. Dixiecrats, these were Southern Democrats, tried to prevent the bill passing, with one politician conducting a 24 hours and 18 minutes filibuster. This is where someone speaks on just about any topic whatsoever to prevent a bill passing and to prevent debate of it. This is a common and often very unpopular tactic used to prevent change. Even Eisenhower himself spoke against the bill, saying that it would not change people's minds, only force something on them. However, despite this opposition, the bill did pass and become law. However, despite the 1957 Civil Rights Act passing, it didn't really change anything. States weren't prepared to prosecute themselves, and very little changed as a result, even if it was a step in the right direction. That was going to change, though, with this much more important law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so don't mix them up. On the 2nd of July 1964, President Johnson signed a law that banned discrimination in voter registration tests, although there were still several loopholes which would need to be addressed later. More on that another time. It also banned discrimination in public spaces. That's a very broad term, so let's have a look at what it means in reality. It banned job discrimination and set up an Equal Opportunities Commission to enforce it. And it gave the government the power to force school desegregation. Yes, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education, those arguments are still going on. It also gave the government the right to remove federal funding from state projects that discriminated. But there were some weaknesses with this act. There was nothing in the law to actually enforce voter registration. That would need to be addressed separately. Black people were often afraid to complain to the Equal Opportunities Commission because of intimidation, and there were few resources to enforce that law anyway, even if they did complain. So consider this. Effectively, the Civil Rights Act ended segregation, and that's the really big breakthrough with it. Or at least it made it illegal in public buildings. And it didn't necessarily change attitudes, or make life noticeably better for most black Americans, or help them vote. But it was still an important step. You might want to pause this here and make some notes on that. Let's consider the lead up to the Civil Rights Act and the differing views of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. After all, Kennedy had spoken out against the violence in Birmingham and proposed that a Civil Rights Act was needed, but he was assassinated in 1963 before he could make it happen. His then Vice President, Lyndon B. Johnson, was sworn in as President and completed the job. So how different were their attitudes? John F. Kennedy, we'll call him JFK. He was president between 1961 and 1963. He appointed black people to high-level jobs. Thurgood Marshall to the courts, for example, and Robert Weaver in his own government. Thurgood Marshall, remember, had been part of the NAACP in the era of Brown versus Board of Education. He also pressed for new laws, but he was assassinated before they could be passed. He used executive orders to support civil rights, e.g. sending troops to Ole Miss. An executive order is where the president says that something should happen immediately. He also requested escorts to protect the Freedom Riders during their campaigns. What about LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson? He was president between 1963 and 1969 when he decided not to run for another term, usually considered as a result of the Tet Offensive, but that's more about the Vietnam side of this topic. He also appointed black people to high-level jobs. Thurgood Marshall joined the Supreme Court, the first African-American to do so, and Patricia Harris became an ambassador, the first African-American woman to do so too. He also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we'll look at in a subsequent rapid revision lesson. He also used executive orders to support civil rights. He made the Alabama National Guard escort the marchers from Selma to Montgomery. Again, a subsequent rapid revision video will be done on that. And he put pressure on Southern politicians to support the Civil Rights Act. So what were the legal gains for black Americans up to this time as a result of the policies of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson? With this diagram, I'll attempt to show some of the gains that have been made for black Americans, at least in the legal system. Firstly, Supreme Court desegregation laws, like Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and Browder v. Gale during the Montgomery bus boycott. This led to some effects. Desegregation. But new rules created unofficial segregation, which made life difficult. There were also school closures. But there was federally enforced desegregation too, like what happened at Little Rock in 1957. Much of this resulted in white resentment and backlash, though. There were also the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965. These too had some effects. New rules were applied, but the rules could be ignored unless enforced by federal officials, many of whom were quite keen to turn a blind eye. This also caused further white resentment. Although this represents some progress, in 1965 as in 1954, there are still many problems. Many black Americans face discrimination in housing, work, education, medical care and treatment by the police in ways that often weren't covered by the laws. Many black Americans pushing for their legal rights faced racist violence, needed the help of federal troops and were still not accepted. They were still being treated as second-class citizens, and they lost some self-esteem too. We should be careful about talking about the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts as being massive victories. They were in a sense, but we've also got to be sympathetic to the fact that they didn't necessarily change people's lives overnight, and that could lead to frustration. More on that at another time though. Let's make some summary points. As I've mentioned, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is often seen in partnership with the later Voting Rights Act of 1965, so check out my rapid revision video on that too. But for now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was an important victory for civil rights groups. We can see in the photograph Lyndon B. Johnson signing the paper and then handing the pen symbolically to Martin Luther King. A great victory. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 effectively banned segregation and made steps towards fighting job discrimination and voter suppression. However, it was not always well enforced, well funded, and voter registration was a significant loophole. Importantly, on its own, it wouldn't change racist attitudes, nor would it immediately improve lives. And for some black Americans, that caused real frustration. But perhaps we can see this as a step in the right direction, and a very significant one. This is finally saying that the law does not support segregation in any public space. That's all for this lesson. I hope that it's been useful to you, and if it has, please like the video. There'll be more content like this appearing soon, so please subscribe to the channel too. Other than that, I'll say thanks very much, and I urge you to watch my other lessons on Selma, and indeed on the Voting Rights Act, to find out more about the context of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But goodbye for now.